Wild animals don't just become easier to live with when humans domesticate them. They can actually start to look different. Their bodies change, their behavior changes, even traits that once helped them survive in the wild can slowly disappear. And the strange part is, you can sometimes look at a domestic animal today and still see pieces of its wild ancestor hiding underneath. A pig still has tusks. A horse can carry the body of an animal built to survive in the wild. And a cow can look so different from the enormous animal it came from that you'd barely recognize the connection. So, what exactly happens to an animal when humans start deciding which individuals get to reproduce? Let's start with one of the strangest examples. Imagine catching a wild carp. It's relatively large, silver or gray, and shaped like a normal fish built to survive outdoors. Now, imagine taking its descendants and, generation after generation, choosing the ones with unusual colors or body shapes. At first, the changes seem trivial. A little more red here, a different tail there. But keep selecting those traits for centuries, and something remarkable happens. You get the goldfish. Ancient Chinese breeders began selecting colorful carp roughly 1,000 years ago, and over generations, those fish developed an extraordinary range of colors, body shapes, fins, and even bizarre-looking eyes. Some became so specialized that they would have struggled to survive without human care. Think about that. The animal didn't simply learn to live with humans. Its body was gradually remodeled around the world humans created for it. And this pattern becomes even easier to see on land. Because some of the animals we think of as ordinary farm animals were once anything but ordinary. Thousands of years ago, people began domesticating African wild asses. Their descendants became the donkeys we know today. But the wild ancestor was built for a very different life. It was adapted to dry environments where food and water could be unpredictable. It needed a body capable of surviving without the protection humans provide. The domestic donkey changed. It's generally smaller than many of its wild relatives, and some of the distinctive markings found in wild asses became less prominent or disappeared in domestic populations. But here's the important part. Domestication doesn't require humans to redesign an animal from scratch. Sometimes the changes are subtle, and sometimes they're dramatic. To see just how dramatic, we need to go back to an animal that once looked almost like a monster. Today, cattle can look almost absurdly familiar. We've seen them on farms, in fields, on trucks, and in advertisements our entire lives. But their wild ancestor was the aurochs, and the aurochs was enormous. Some stood around 6 feet at the shoulder, with long legs, powerful muscles, and enormous horns. Imagine standing beside one. This wasn't the slow, domesticated-looking cow we picture today. It was a large, wild herbivore built to survive without fences, barns, feedlots, or humans protecting it. Then, humans began selecting which animals would reproduce. And slowly, the animal changed. Different breeds developed different body shapes. Some became much heavier. Some became more productive at producing milk or meat. Some were even bred to lack horns altogether. And that's where domestication becomes more than a story about appearance. Because humans weren't simply choosing the animals they liked looking at, we were choosing which traits were useful to us. And once humans control reproduction, those choices can become biological changes. Here's where it gets interesting. The same thing happened with goats. Their wild ancestors were built for rocky environments, wary of predators, and capable of surviving without us. But once humans began keeping them, different populations started moving in different directions. People selected animals for size, for fertility, for milk, for wool, for color, for body shape, even for traits as seemingly minor as ear shape. Over thousands of years, that created hundreds of domestic breeds. And when you compare some of them with wild goats, the difference can be surprisingly obvious. But there is something even more important happening underneath the fur. Behavior is changing too. A wild animal has to assume that unfamiliar creatures might be dangerous. A domestic animal lives in an environment where humans control much of the danger. So, traits associated with extreme fear or aggression can become less useful. Animals that tolerate humans better are easier to keep. They are easier to handle. And, most importantly, they are more likely to be kept and bred. That means humans don't have to deliberately think, let's make this animal calmer. We only have to keep choosing the animals that are easier to live with. Generation after generation, the population changes. And that brings us to one of the clearest examples of what domestication can do. Look at a domestic horse. Then imagine its wild ancestor moving across open grassland. The wild animal needed to travel efficiently, avoid predators, find food, and survive changing weather. Domestic horses were placed under completely different pressures. Humans selected them for speed, strength, endurance, selective, temperament, and traits that made them useful for particular jobs. Some became powerful enough to pull enormous loads. Others became specialized for racing. Others were selected for riding. The result is an animal that can look radically different depending on what humans wanted from it. But here's the strange part. Even after thousands of years of domestication, the wild blueprint doesn't simply vanish. It's still there. You can change the animal dramatically without completely erasing the animal it used to be. And sometimes, when domesticated animals escape human control, some of those old survival traits become useful again, which is exactly why domestication isn't the same thing as simply making an animal tame. And if you're enjoying seeing the hidden wild animal inside familiar domestic species, hit like and subscribe. Because this channel is about exactly that kind of question. What happens to animals when humans start changing the rules of survival? Now, there's one animal where the difference between wild and domestic becomes especially obvious. The pig. Put a farm pig beside a wild boar and you can immediately see the difference. The wild boar is usually leaner and more muscular. It has a longer snout, coarser hair, stronger shoulders and neck, and, of course, those unmistakable tusks. Domestic pigs have been shaped heavily by human selection. Farmers generally don't need an animal covered in coarse hair, equipped with dangerous tusks, and determined to escape. They need an animal that grows efficiently and can be managed. So generation after generation, humans selected for traits that worked better in that environment. But the wild genes didn't disappear. And that's why domestication can sometimes feel like the wild animal is still hiding underneath. Give domestic pigs the opportunity to escape, and some populations can become surprisingly wild again. Not because domestication suddenly disappears, but because the underlying biology never completely left. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because humans don't only change animals by carefully choosing which ones to breed, sometimes the environment itself does the selecting. In the late 20th century, something happened to African elephants that provides an extraordinary example. During periods of intense ivory poaching, elephants with large tusks were targeted more heavily. That meant elephants with little or no tusks were more likely to survive and reproduce. And within just a few generations, researchers observed a dramatic increase in the proportion of female elephants born without tusks in some affected populations. Think about what that means. Nobody was standing there with a breeding program saying, "Let's create tuskless elephants." Humans simply changed the rules. Big tusks became dangerous. Small or absent tusks became safer. And natural selection did the rest. This is not domestication. The elephants weren't becoming tame. They weren't becoming dependent on humans. But the example reveals something crucial about domestication. When the pressures acting on an animal change, the animal can change with them. And domestication takes that principle and makes it deliberate. Instead of predators, drought, starvation, or competition deciding which animals reproduce, humans increasingly make that decision. We choose the calmer animal, the larger animal, the faster-growing animal, the animal with more milk, the animal with better wool, the animal with the color we want. And after enough generations, the population no longer looks exactly like the wild animal it came from. So, what does domestication actually do? There isn't one single domesticated look. Goldfish became smaller, stranger, and more colorful. Cattle became heavier and more specialized. Goats split into hundreds of breeds. Horses were reshaped for work, transport, racing, and riding. Pigs became more manageable and productive. And some animals developed changes in behavior alongside their physical traits. That's because domestication isn't one mutation. It's a long process of selection. Humans create a new environment. Animals that fit that environment reproduce more successfully. Their traits become more common. Then humans select again, and again, and again, until, eventually, the animal standing in front of us can look almost nothing like the creature its ancestors once were. But there is a fascinating contradiction hiding inside all of this. The more successfully we domesticate an animal, the more dependent some versions of that animal can become on the world we created. A highly specialized farm animal may be incredibly productive under human care, but place it back into the wild, and those same traits can become weaknesses. The huge body, the altered proportions, the reduced defenses, the dependence on human food, the calmer temperament. Traits that are useful to us aren't necessarily useful in nature. And that's the real paradox of domestication. We don't simply make wild animals better. We make them better suited to our world. And sometimes that means making them worse suited to the world they originally came from. So the next time you look at a cow, a pig, a goat, a horse, or even a goldfish, you're not just looking at a familiar animal. You're looking at the result of thousands of generations of choices. Some deliberate, some accidental, some driven by economics, some driven by survival, and some driven simply by what humans happen to find useful or desirable. The wild animal didn't disappear overnight. We slowly selected pieces of it away, and generation by generation, we replaced them with traits that worked better beside us, which raises a much bigger question. If humans can transform animals this dramatically, what wild animal living around us today could be next? And that question gets much stranger when you realize that the best candidate may not be the strongest, smartest, or most useful animal. It may simply be the one that is already changing because of us. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more stories about animals, evolution, and the strange ways humans have changed the natural world. Because the next animal we domesticate might already be living beside us, and we may not even realize what's happening yet. What is the next wild animal humans could domesticate? Most candidates fail the test. But one already has the right biology, and scientists have shown that its behavior can change dramatically under selective breeding. So, which animal is closest? We shall see that in the next one. Link in the description. Thank you for watching.